Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we actually have some news surrounding the Milwaukee Bucks that we got early in the offseason. Some changes coming to the Bucks coaching staff and changes not coming to the front office. We'll get into that, take a look back at the weekend of the playoffs and our constant question of what do the Bucks take away from what's currently going on here in the postseason? And do we see even more changes across the league given a surprising team winning yesterday's draft lottery? We'll open up those conversations after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined by Camille Davis. You can find me in season on the Bucks Radio Network. You can find Camille on the Technical Foul podcast, the Pack a Day podcast during football season, on the Carry the G in MKE podcast as well. And we both thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day, free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on YouTube as well, as some of you have jumped into the show. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by PrizePicks. It is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Head over to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code, all lowercase, LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. We start with the news here, Camille, and I've already seen a couple of comments getting into it. The Bucks make some changes to their coaching staff. We knew this was going to be coming, as Doc Rivers all but told us in his end of season press conference. And frankly, he had talked about this during the season as well, shortly after he was hired, that, you know, it's a big staff. And Doc had indicated, look, even without the additions that I made and Dave Yeager and Rex Kalamian and Pete Dominguez, it's still a pretty big staff. So we're going to have to evaluate some things. He insinuated changes were going to be coming, and those changes, you know, you assumed meant subtractions. That's what we saw over the weekend with the news coming that the Bucks have let go of assistant coaches DJ Baker, Sidney Dobner, and Josh Oppenheimer. So those are assistant coaches 2, 3, and 4 to no longer be a part of the staff since Doc took over. Nate Mitchell was the first of those just after the All-Star break. We knew change was going to be coming, as I mentioned, but were you, I hesitate to even say surprised, because I'll just get this out of the way. You and I talked about this before we started recording. My whole spiel is we don't know who's good and who's bad with assistant coaches and what to expect there. It's very different from football and other sports where, you know, this guy's the defensive coordinator. We know Rex Kalamian is attached to the defense and Dave Yeager is attached to the offense. Doesn't mean that's all they do. So I think oftentimes you hear the same name over and over, and we assume that coach is good or that coach is bad. The reality is we don't know. We don't know what drills they're running behind the scenes, what scouts they're doing, etc. So with that out of the way, as best you can answer, were you surprised at all by any of these names?
Not necessarily. Like you mentioned, Doc mentioned way back in like January about the size of that particular coaching staff and how over time he was going to look to try to get some of his people in there. And once he did bring on some guys, a coaching staff with 11 people, that's a very big coaching staff as it is. So knowing that the season ended, figured that some names would be coming down the pipeline of guys who were going to be relieved from their duties as an assistant coach with the Milwaukee Bucks. Now, when I saw Josh Oppenheimer's name, I was like, that's an interesting one, because Oppenheimer has seemed to just, regardless of who's in head job there, like he has seemed to find a way to be back on this team over and over and over and over again. I mean, he was rehired by Coach Bud after his first stint, and then just kind of was able to stay with the franchise since then. And we've had lots of conversations, and it's generally known of how close that Oppenheimer was to Giannis and their relationship. He's been known as like the shot doctor, which for some fans, they questioned that moniker, given the shooting numbers for Giannis in particular. But this was part of what we knew was going to come. Like Doc has to come in and have a coaching staff with people that he wants around him. He mentioned like I might find some people on this staff already who turn out to be like new best friends of mine, and it's going to become a vital part of my coaching structure. But nah, no surprises seeing who was let go. I do want to say shout out to Sydney Dobner because of the history that she was able to make along the way during her coaching time here with the Bucks as the first female coach in franchise history. So that will always stand, even though she's no longer going to be on this coach with Doc. So just looking to see if there's going to be any additional moves with this coaching staff or anybody coming on, coming off. So that's something I'll be keeping an eye on going forward.
Yeah, first female assistant coach in Bucks team history. She started in the film room, which again, if you want to become an NBA coach, get a job as a video assistant and in the film room. That's what Sydney did, working her way up through the ranks. And you get the sense too, especially the reverence that players spoke of her. She's gonna find a job.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the unfortunate part of the business. But those are the changes for now. I don't know that this means the staff is done making changes here for Doc Rivers' coaching staff. You mentioned, getting to know new people and interviewing them. And as Doc said way back in January, you kind of learn this guy wasn't a part of my staff before or part of my group, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Now he is, that I've gotten the chance to work with him. It's hard to think Joe Prunty is not in that category, just how much we saw Doc Rivers lean on him throughout those last few months. And Joe Prunty is a chameleon, that he's been on all these different staffs. So I'd imagine he is here to stay. The Josh Oppenheimer news that you pointed to, man, he had survived so many different eras of Bucks basketball. I think it was 2012 through 16 that he was here. So he was a part of prior to Jason Kidd. He was on the Jason Kidd era.
Larry Drew.
Yeah, Larry Drew returned and was part of Mike Budenholzer's staff and then Adrian Griffin's staff. And now they once again part ways with Josh Oppenheimer. So that's going to be interesting. And I saw Sam and a few others point this out too. We heard Giannis, I should clarify Sam in our chats here. We heard Giannis mention that he is going to spend time with Damian Lillard this offseason. We've heard Doc talk about that too, that Giannis didn't have a chance to get to meet Damian Lillard in terms of being teammates and work out with him and develop that chemistry in the offseason. Obviously, we've documented what Dame went through in the offseason. So them getting together, even if it's only for a week, 2 weeks, whatever it is, spending some more of that time, as Giannis said, it's not just going to be basketball stuff. That's going to be big, but also Chris Haynes mentioning Phil Beckner. And you've probably heard that name associated with Damian Lillard in the past. I think he even popped up on a podcast earlier this year talking about Dame's offseason. But the reports from Chris Haynes, who, if there's news surrounding Giannis and Dame, Chris Haynes would be the source that I would go to, saying that Giannis and Dame are going to train with Phil Beckner in Portland this summer. So again, bringing in new voices, finding different ways to do things, but most importantly, developing that chemistry for that duo.
And that's of the utmost importance. Like we've talked about the Dame and Giannis combo, the duo, so on and so forth, and how important that was going to be for the Milwaukee Bucks. And it still is. Like that is still going to really be the engine of the team that's driving it. So hearing that they're getting together in Portland and just spending time together first, before we even get to the basketball part of it, just that bonding, getting to know each other part a little bit better, because I think about the relationship with Giannis and Chris. Giannis made jokes like, I don't really need to see Chris. I've seen Chris enough and stuff like that. But getting to know the people who you're going to battle with on a night in and night out basis is so important. Like together this season, they went through a lot of adversity together. So that's already something that can kind of bring them together. But now connecting on some more personal levels, connecting just more on that human level is going to be really important. So you're able to establish that trust and understand how you're communicating with one another as well. So that part's cool. And then of course the basketball fit part of it is something I'm looking forward to seeing. Like hearing Doc after his exit interview, just mentioning the fact that, hey, I'm going to be sending Chris and Dame and Giannis all kinds of things throughout the summer of what I want them to be working on, and having that direction and clarity of knowing how we're expecting to use you. And again, having that stability, which has been something that Giannis has talked about of what he's looking forward going into this particular offseason after having the coaching switches, after having new teammates come in. And it's not to say that new teammates won't come in this year as well, but understanding that, hey, Dame, me, Chris, for sure, like we're going to be working on some things and trying to get that 2-man game together with Dame. So absolutely love hearing that they're spending time together in Portland and working on the game because, listen, it's going to be a long off season. So they're going to have some time to be able to work through some things.
Really quickly to just catch up on some of the comments to our everydayers who are there with us on the live show today. Wish Coach Ham would come back to Milwaukee. I think that is the sentiment for a lot of Bucks fans. I would be surprised if it happens. Not in a bad way, but just if you're Darvin Ham, I don't know that being fired in the offseason as a head coach, you don't typically jump to the sidelines as an assistant immediately. If he does, I get the sense his spot may be out west, which we'll get to coming up in our next segment here. That's the other piece of news. A former Bucks coach finding a new job, and one that is very, very interesting. And the even arguably bigger piece of news here, Camille, is the front office news that we talked about. Coaching changes for the Bucks. There will be no change in the front office. So we will get into that conversation coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Well, time now to talk to you about our friends over at PrizePicks. And right now is the time to get in on the playoff action and win up to 100 times your money on PrizePicks as you and the world's best players take the game to a whole new level during basketball's postseason. We are in the thick of it right now here with basketball going on and the playoffs. You can win up to 100 times your money on PrizePicks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000 with basketball and hockey entries on PrizePicks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. PrizePicks even offers injury insurance. So if your player goes down in the first half of a game, that player gets rebooted. No other service will give you that type of service. So head over to PrizePicks, again, America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 3 million users on PrizePicks. Very easy to use. Download the app, join those 3 million members, and find multiple ways for you to win. All you have to do is pick more than or less than on 2 or more player stat projections, and from there, watch the winnings roll in. Go to PrizePicks right now, use the code LOCKEDONNBA, and get a first deposit match up to $100. That code, again, LOCKEDONNBA, LOCKEDONNBA, and get a first deposit match up to $100 on PrizePicks. And if you are one of those watching TV during the day, maybe you got it locked on to Fox Sports or ESPN, and you always have to turn down the volume because of all of that shouting, make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all of the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, news, and it streams 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Well, we mentioned even more news here, Camille, so I suppose let's finish that point. If Darvin Ham does take an assistant job, I think a lot of us assume it would be with the Phoenix Suns, where Mike Budenholzer, congrats to him, has been named the next, or I don't know if it's official yet, but Mike Budenholzer is going to be the head coach of the Suns. That was one of the interesting teams because of Bud's ties to the Arizona area. You knew it was only a matter of time that Bud was going to get a job, which brings some relief for the Bucks that's now just 2 head coaches you're paying versus 3. But it's funny, if we'll finish with this. You go back to last year and you thought, man, these are some great openings that are out there with the Bucks, the 76ers, and Joel Embiid. And you thought, well, Bud's going to have his choice. We saw Bud just say, no, I'm cool with taking the year off, playing golf. I'm sure he drank a lot of wine and collecting that money, waiting for the right offer. He was linked to the Lakers earlier in the offseason, and when the Suns job opened up, that's the one that just seemed like this makes the most sense for Bud's ties to Arizona. What he can do offensively, we associate him as a defensive coach, but he can work with that group. And again, the big thing, we witnessed it in his absence, and I think you saw a lot of it from afar in Phoenix, structure. That is the number one thing that Bud is going to bring out there.
Yeah, hopefully they get him a point guard for that team as well. That's something that Phoenix was really missing. But no, congrats to Bud on getting a new coaching gig in Phoenix. But one thing I will say that's so interesting to think about is just the coaching cycle, right? Given the influx of like these superstar-led teams and how many stars are on these teams, a lot of times when something needs to change with the franchise, it's the coach that goes before some of the players because you want to see if these investments can pay out. And I saw this and I couldn't believe it at first, but it mentioned that with this new hire of whoever the new head coach is, as we said, we believe it's Mike Budenholzer, as reports are saying, this will be Kevin Durant's 5th coach in 2 years. Like, it's crazy to think about how the coaching cycles go. Like, beginning of last season, the 2022-23 season, he had Steve Nash. We know that didn't work out. And then in came Jacques Vaughn, and then he asked to be traded, and he got traded to Phoenix where they had Monty Williams. Then Monty Williams was let go, and then they bring on Frank Vogel, who only lasted a year. And now we are thinking it's going to be Mike Budenholzer coming in there. So I do hope that he has some better luck in regards to being able to kind of stick for a few years there. It's a high pressure situation walking into that Phoenix job, just as walking into that Lakers job will be. We understand also the Lakers history with head coaches as well. So good luck to Bud in Phoenix going forward. And it's going to be really interesting to watch because the way these coaching cycles go, who knows what the next quote unquote good looking job is going to be on the market and how sought after it actually really is.
And look, I get people are going to dismiss that. Well, LeBron is actually the shadow coach and GM. The Lakers job is still a good job. So there's some good jobs that are out there. I mean, you could make a strong case the Lakers job is a better job than the Suns job. I think part of that was Bud basically getting to implement everything. And there's going to be some of those questions for the reasons we mentioned in LA of how much of this is my stamp of things. That's not going to be the case. At least we would assume, who knows with what we've seen from Matt Ishbia, but you would think it's not going to be the case in Phoenix where he can really say, okay, this is how we're going to do things. Mm-hmm. And as we pointed out moments ago through the years as well, that was the one thing you really noticed as soon as Bud arrived. Everything had purpose. Everything was structured. He lifted your floor. You'll hear that a lot with Bud, and it's not to say he's not a high ceiling coach because the Bucks won a championship, right? He can do both, but you know that floor is being raised where it's no longer, well, at least when you had Bud, it's no longer can you get to the playoffs and can you win? That was basically a given of, all right, you're going to be one of these tier teams. How much further up can you go? So again, congrats to Mike Budenholzer. Have not seen, first of all, we haven't seen that it's become official yet, but I haven't seen when that press conference is going to be. But that is when I think a lot of Bucks fans are going to be interested to view along with and see what Bud has to say about his year off and his time back here in Milwaukee and what he learned there as well. The other piece of news, not to, by the way, and get lost in the shuffle, is we learned late in the week that John Horst is here to stay. So this was, I suppose, another piece of news broken by Peter Fagan, who delivered that. I didn't see what function that was at, but essentially said John Horst is going nowhere. And then the report came out either Friday or over the weekend that the Bucks had declined permission to the Pistons to speak to John Horst. So look, I'm not going to speak for John Horst and whether or not, John Horst was really looking to leave. But you do get the sense here that the Bucks approach is, look, we've talked about windows and we know maybe it's just next year. Maybe it's a little more than that. Depends on some of the retooling the Bucks are able to do here in the offseason. But we know we got these three guys that you and I have spent quite a bit of time talking about and praising in Giannis, Dame, and Chris. We feel pretty good as long as those guys are healthy. So let's keep this thing together for at least one last run. And then if it blows up and doesn't go our way, then we can revisit. But let's hold on to this until the wheels fall off was the sense I got.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense. We mentioned just how much changed over the last year for this Milwaukee Bucks team, and heading into the offseason, Giannis mentioned one of the things that he was most looking forward to was stability. Stability within the organization, knowing who's in place, knowing who's the coaches, knowing, who's in charge, who's going to be on the team, so on and so forth. And had the Bucks lost John Horst, talk about drastic changes. Like, that's losing John Horst and trying to get somebody else to come in and take on that GM role for like the Bucks is going to be really difficult. So it's a good thing that he is staying. I saw some Bucks fans who seem not to be really high on John Horst, but I mean, that's the guy who kept Giannis in Milwaukee, who orchestrated some very major trades. Under him, the Bucks have a championship. So while every move did not pan out with John Horst, and for most GMs, it won't. A lot of them were moves where I understood why you're taking that shot, and also moves that actually normally improve the team. The miss is missed, no doubt about that, but he's not, no one's batting 1,000% here. So I'm happy to see that he's staying. I mean, John Horst is from Michigan. There were reports that he had interest in that position with Detroit, which again makes some sense given the connections between the two. But I'm happy to hear that he's not going anywhere, and that it seems like we're going to try to ride this window out in Milwaukee with the core that they have, not just talking about on the court, but also in that front office as well.
Yeah, and look, you mentioned there were moves that did not work out, and I think the front office would be the first to say, yeah, we didn't get what we expected here. But I keep going back to he may not be batting 1,000 on his moves, as you mentioned. No general manager, no front office executive is, but think about the PJ Tucker trade, right? Smaller scale, it helped you win a championship. We didn't think the Bucks had the assets to get PJ Tucker. He was the guy that I think all of us had circled, and they were linked to him of, hey, they're interested, but it was one of those, yeah, I'm interested, but how much is this going to cost me? Oh, I can't afford that car. So I guess I'll keep looking. Same with Drew Holiday. That was another one that you started to hear more rumblings. Second half of that season about, I don't know if this team can go as far as they want with Eric Bledsoe. Drew Holiday makes a whole lot of sense, but it was the same thing of, I don't know that the Bucks have the assets to get him. And they did. And of course, last summer with Damian Lillard, fall with Damian Lillard, where again, made a whole lot of sense, but it seemed like a pipe dream, and he was able to come through with those. So, those are the big things, and it's those moves that kept Giannis from catching a side eye and looking elsewhere. Maybe I should look somewhere else to extend my career. So, look, you can point all the moves that didn't work. You have to point those ones out as well. And I've seen a whole lot of it just proved we made the wrong trade last year. It is far too early to jump to those assumptions. I think you and I have talked about this before too. Maybe we'll end up being wrong. I still stand by it was the right move to make because of the whole, what's the definition of insanity? And that's essentially what the Bucks would have done. Of seeing, all right, let's just keep running this group back over and over with very minimal changes on the edges. We know the offense is not going to be good enough in the postseason. We just hope the defense is going to carry us year after year. And we saw injuries happen, everything else. It's not enough. And even this past offseason or this past playoff run, let's say they didn't make that trade. You and I kind of kicked around too. Hey, in hindsight, do you kind of say, well, if we kept the group together, look at how they changed, how they called defensively, you would have been a lot more or able to get away with a lot more stuff. Maybe you're in a better spot, maybe, but with no Giannis, again, you make that trade, you don't make that trade, and it's, all right, Drew, we need you to be a very, very reliable, consistent secondary scorer. And again, it's no disrespect to Drew Holiday. That is not his strength. So jury's still out, but I know I feel that way. And I think you do too. I still feel it was the right move to make.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, I was seeing some people after the first game in the series when Dame, exploded for 35 in the first half. Like, I get it. I take back everything I said. Like, I get it. I see the vision. Like, it didn't necessarily go the way that everybody expected it to go or hoped that it would go in year one of this pairing. But again, like, let's give it a little bit time before we see, because for some things you don't get immediate return. Like we've talked about Minnesota. what we saw from them. If you would have talked about the Gobert trade after last year alone, it would have been like complete waste of assets and didn't get them anywhere, so on and so forth. The jury is still out on how this series is going to play between Denver and Minnesota, but you've seen the leaps that Minnesota took in year 2 of this pairing with that team over the year 1. So for the Bucks with Dame and Giannis and everything like that, again, I also still think that was the right trade at the time. But now let's see how you can tweak around the edges here. How can you make this team make a little bit more sense? And then let's see how this all plays out going forward, because I do think that Dame and Giannis and Chris is a core that can get you to a championship if everything else goes right for the team. We've talked about everything it takes to win a championship. It's not just the talent. It's not just being good. It's injury luck as well. So hopefully the Bucks can have better injury luck last year. And also we can have some more synergy from the start with this team as they continue to grow under Doc's system.
Yeah, and a couple other pieces for us to get to. I tell you what, I'll save some of the commentary we have for some of the comments that are trickling in for after the break. And also, you mentioned the playoffs, a check in on what's going on there, and we mentioned a very unexpected team winning the draft lottery. So, what could that mean for the Bucks and other teams? And maybe it changed John Horst's mind as well about that Pistons job. So we'll get into those conversations in our final segment here after the break on Locked On Bucks. Well, it's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. It's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, we'll get to some of the comments here in just a second, but the Atlanta Hawks won the draft lottery, Camille. So they will have the #1 overall pick. If you're the Detroit Pistons, you got to be just thinking, like, what do we got to do here that they finish 5th once again? And I kind of joked about it, but also if you're John Horst, it's that job looked a little different if I had Cade Cunningham and the #1 overall pick.
Yeah. Even though this upcoming draft is being heralded as one that's not as strong, having the #1 draft pick is always going to be a coup that you want to try to get. So, yeah, falling from worst team in the league and then getting the 5th pick again, that stings. But for Atlanta, what's interesting about that is there's already been rumors about them possibly looking to blow up their backcourt with Trae Young and DeJounte Murray, with rumors about Trae Young possibly heading to the Lakers, so on and so forth. So now my question is, seeing them get the #1 draft pick, does that change any of their offseason plans? Do they still go ahead with the trading of one of those 2 assets and or do they try to take that #1 draft pick, attach it to somewhere else as well, and try to, get another bet in? Do they make the pick? Do they keep the pick? It'll be interesting to watch, especially with this Hawks team, given the fact that, 3 seasons ago, they were in the Eastern Conference Finals against the Milwaukee Bucks. And it was looking like, hey, they just need to tweak a couple things and they can be, back in the same spot again. And things have not played out that way for the Hawks so far. So it's a team in the East to keep an eye on. They've been out of the playoff. They were in the play-in team so far this year, but someone who you haven't really taken as seriously. So, is this an offseason where the Hawks can get this roster constructed in a way that makes a bit more sense and get them in a better position to contend? So that'll be interesting to watch. Also, just for kicks and giggles, Houston getting the 3rd pick from Brooklyn from the James Harden trade. I just said, wow, okay, that's interesting. As, of course, then Houston loses their draft pick at number 12, and that goes to Oklahoma City, which how many draft picks
the rich get richer, right?
It's unbelievable at this point.
And look, I'd be very curious too if you're going to start to hear a lot of names coming up. It seemed like this was headed towards one of those off seasons where a lot of teams are in the, man, we got to do things differently, when we saw what the Thunder were doing, what the Timberwolves were doing, what the Pacers, even to a lesser extent, were doing. All right, we see the blueprint is we got to play fast. We got to be, maybe not with Indiana, but we got to be defensive minded and we got to be younger. I feel like we're going to have this conversation every single week, but it's what we all fall victim to with being prisoner of the moment. After 2 games in that series against the Timberwolves with the Nuggets, it was basically, well, what's going to happen with Denver? They're clearly losing to the Timberwolves. We thought that was a budding dynasty. So Denver is going to have to retool in some ways. And again, every team is going to be looking to get these long athletic wings. The last part of that statement is true. Every team is looking for that. But yeah, let's say we get a finals. That's the Denver Nuggets and the Boston Celtics, which at this point I would guess is the number 1 betting favorite for a finals matchup. I'm not sure how much narrative that changes, that we go through week to week and series to series where it's, well, this is the new NBA and this is the changing of the guard. And then you just see, okay, it's more than 1 game. You can't overreact to 1 game or 2 games. And it's more about minding the course and finding what works for you and really cultivating that. I do want to get to this comment because this is an interesting team to keep an eye on in the offseason. The New Orleans Pelicans, we already saw they are not going to be bringing back Jonas Valanciunas. They are looking for a floor spacing big. And I know Bucks fans are going to immediately jump to, well, the Bucks have a floor spacing big who it seems like half of Bucks fans are already done with and ready to move on from. Look, the Pelicans are going to be an interesting team to monitor in the offseason because of those changes, because of looking at their roster and figuring out how do we maximize things around Zion Williamson. I don't know that they're a great trading partner for the Bucks. Even with moving on from Jonas Valanciunas, Brandon Ingram, the Bucks don't have the assets. And look, we just had that conversation with John Horst, but this is literally with the handcuffs. The Bucks do not have the assets to bring in Brandon Ingram. He's making $36 million. And not only that, Camille, he's a pending free agent. So you would be bringing him in and then adding another massive contract to Giannis and Damian Lillard in the final year of Chris Middleton. Again, we'll get into this in much more detail as we move closer to free agency beginning. The Bucks avoided the second apron for this season. They are not going to avoid it for next season. There are ways they could, which would open up some other things for them to do, like a 2-for-1 trade and an exception. But that would be basically trading a player like Brook Lopez or Bobby Portis for draft picks, something along those lines, to a team with cap space. So that's where it doesn't work out, that you can't really look at the Pelicans and say, well, just trade them Brook Lopez, take back Brandon Ingram. Brandon Ingram is making more than $10 million more per year than Brook Lopez. So the Bucks can't do that. Herbert Jones, I've seen thrown around in that, well, they want to move on from Herb Jones. I mean, we've heard that. I don't understand why. And even then, that's not the move that you see a team like New Orleans, who, look, if all goes well, they could be a top 4 team in the West. That's not the type of move you make where you trade a young athletic wing for a center in his mid-30s that is on the final year of his contract. So I just don't think the Pelicans are a great trade target individually for the Bucks. You could talk me into 3-way deals, but as Brian Windhorst and others have always said, if you got a 3-team deal, if you got to bring in a third team, you just don't have a trade.
Yeah, that's the part of it, because like you said, anytime we're going to hear in this offseason that a team is looking for a shooting big, I'm sure there are going to be Bucks fans saying, can we offer you a 35, 36-year-old Brook Lopez? Is that of interest to you? And for some teams, the answer might be yes. But for New Orleans, it's going to be interesting to look at, because as you were saying that, I was thinking like the only way that seems to make sense would be a 3-team trade, like a multi-team trade. The Herb Jones piece, I think we mentioned it during the trade deadline that just passed when there were rumblings that he might be on the block, which was, for me, why? And if he is, like, of course, I would love to see him on the Bucks, because he is the type of wing player that every contending team is looking for. But there's a reason to keep an eye on the Pelicans. I saw this earlier with their GM Griffin. He was talking about there's no other conclusion to draw after the season so far. And he was like, This is not going to be a summer of complicity here. Like, it's time to get better. And for years, we've heard with the Pelicans, like, we just got to, hey, let's go with continuity and let's just see and let's see what this group can actually do when they're healthy. And this year, they got enough of a large sample size with Zion in their lineup to see, like, what is going to work for them. And it seems like Brandon Ingram is going to be somebody on his way out. Yeah. And I don't see a fit for Ingram with this particular roster. So, like, again, it'd probably have to be a 3-team trade, but they are definitely somebody who is looking to make some moves this summer, which could change the landscape in the league for sure. So something to keep an eye on. But like you also mentioned, with how things can change so quickly in the playoffs in itself, one thing that's standing out to me again from the playoffs, the health piece of it, but I keep watching the Pacers and I just keep being like, look at who else is showing up for this team right now. And for them, just one last note because of the Wisconsin ties with Tyrese Halliburton, but he's been a lot more aggressive over the last 2 games for the Pacers and has played great dividends for them. And that just reminds me again of just the importance of having a lead guard, a ball handler that can assert his will on the game when he wants to. And that's something that stood out to me with watching the Pacers and the Knicks in that series with Halliburton and thinking about how Dame can also have that type of control over a game. In addition to that, just watching how games are called. And just, again, I have to say, I really hate the fact I didn't get to watch Giannis at all in these playoffs, especially with the way the whistle is.
Yeah. Look, the Pelicans, they can renounce Jonas Valanciunas and get under that luxury tax, and that opens up a lot of things for them. I think they're going to be very active. You mentioned Brandon Ingram is the big name. I would assume that's who they move. You can talk about log jams, as we've seen. It's true. You know, when you think about Herb Jones and even Trey Murphy playing similar positions, Larry Nance as well. But it's not a bad thing to have a log jam. So I would assume Brandon Ingram is probably the biggest name they would love to move. I'm sure they wouldn't admit it, but I would guess CJ McCollum, if you could find a home for him and his $30+ million, they would look into that as well. But yes, I mean, look, Herb Jones is the exact type of guy when you watch the playoffs. What do the Bucks need? Perfect. You can play him next to Giannis. He can defend multiple positions. You could play Giannis at the 5. It's like having another McDaniels brother that you would have out there. So that makes a whole lot of sense. I don't see, and I understand the irony of making this point in the same show where we talked about, hey, John Horst made moves where you didn't think it was possible. I think the big difference here is the cap constraints that the Bucks are going to be up against. So I would love it, but it really seems like a pipe dream for the Bucks. But it's going to be a very busy offseason. You get the sense of teams that are starting to come to grips with the second apron and what that means. Teams that are staring it down on the horizon and know, okay, this is going to be our last chance at doing something. And again, you know, look, we said, hey, what happens if the Timberwolves win? Now that series is evened out, and I think everybody's leaning towards the Nuggets are probably going to win. What happens, Camille, if that team you mentioned somehow represents the East in the finals and maybe catches some more breaks with injuries to their opponents? What does that mean for the Boston Celtics and other teams? So that's why it's fun to have these types of conversations or dip your toe into that water there, but we never really know what's going to happen until the playoffs wrap up and you get the sense of how teams view this. Who are the teams that are going to overreact? Who are the ones that are saying, now we're going to stay the course? And who are those stealth under the radar teams, as we've seen John Horst really operate in the past? So a lot more clarity will start to come our way once we get through this postseason here. As for this upcoming week, we mentioned we are going to start to dig into individual player profiles. So we're going to knock our first one of those out on tomorrow's show. Take a look back at, we're not going to divulge which player it is just yet, but take a look back at their season, the cap situation, their contract standing, where this player needs to improve, what their strengths were, what realistic expectations are for them as well. So we'll start to do that on an individual basis, starting with tomorrow's show. And then Wednesday, the show, we are going to be joined by Brian Sampson of Bucks Film Room to kind of get his thoughts on a look back on what we saw from the Bucks in that series against the Pacers, the season as a whole, and his thoughts on the offseason. So quite a few interviews on the show coming up in the offseason here as well. Do we have 2 games tonight or just one? We have the 2
tonight,
games.
I
So
believe.
yeah, so we didn't mention Jason Kidd and the Dallas Mavericks looking to go up 3-1 in that series. And Camille, this is the last thing I'll say. We'll get any takes or thoughts you have on it. Who would have thought? I can't believe I'm going to say this. Jason Kidd is actually a pretty decent playoff coach.
I wouldn't have. I mean, I have a friend who's a Lakers fan who's on Tech File with us as well. And he was mentioning, like, I think this Lakers gig is doing wonders for Jason Kidd. And I was like, yeah, okay, whatever. Even watching Mavericks fans throughout this season, there were calls of fire Jason Kidd throughout the regular season this year. And yet somehow this playoff series, like, he's been finding the ways to push the right buttons at the right time. Outside of game ones, Dallas seems to come out flat in game ones. But after that, it seems as if it's not Kidd alone, the coaching staff as a whole has been able to really find the right buttons to press.
Our guy, Sean Sweeney.
Right. And it's looking good for him. If they go up 3-1 on the Thunder, it'll be interesting to see how the Thunder respond, being a young team, first time in this situation. Meanwhile, Dallas has 2 lead guards with Luka and Kyrie, who neither seem to just get frazzled. So, like, that's always good to have on the court as well. But yeah, that'll be a shock to see Kidd moving along there with that team.
And some other comments trickling into the Cavs are another interesting team. I think we're all assuming they're going to lose this series to the Celtics, so that's going to be an interesting team with Donovan Mitchell's pending free agency a year from now, and just again log jams and duplicity at positions. And are they another team to keep an eye on as a big trade target in the offseason? Maybe not for the Bucks, but what that means within the division and the rest of the Eastern Conference. So still a lot more to sort out here in these upcoming weeks here. We will be back tomorrow, as I mentioned, with our first player profile of the offseason. For Camille, I am Justin. We will talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.